My name is Kelsey Voss, and the last time my family asked what I did for a living, my stepfather laughed so hard he spilled his bourbon and said, "Sweetheart, government work is what people say when they're too embarrassed to admit they're a glorified secretary." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 hours earlier, I'd authorized a raid that would dismantle a trafficking network operating in 4 states. I was 42 years old, and I'd been lying to my family for 17 years. Not lying exactly, omitting. There's a difference, though the result is the same. They believed I was a mid-level bureaucrat shuffling papers in some forgotten corner of a federal building. They believed I wore polyester pantsuits and ate sad desk lunches and would retire with a modest pension and nothing else to show for my life. They believed this because I let them. The truth was considerably more complicated. I was the executive director of the Internal Affairs Division for the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Internal Investigations, a position that existed in the shadows of the federal hierarchy, known only to those who needed to know. My job was to investigate other investigators, to root out corruption in the very agencies tasked with protecting the nation. I reported directly to the Deputy Secretary. My security clearance was higher than most senators, and my office was a locked suite on the 7th floor of a building that didn't officially exist on any public directory. But to my family, I was just Kelsey. Poor, boring Kelsey with her vague government job. It started when I was 25, fresh out of my second master's degree, Georgetown for International Security, Oxford for Criminology, when I joined DHS as a junior analyst. Back then, I'd been excited to tell my mother about the position. She'd been planning her annual garden party, the kind of event where she trotted out her children's accomplishments like prize roses. "Government work," she'd said, her smile freezing. How practical. My older brother, Preston, was a cardiac surgeon. My sister, Fallon, had just made partner at a white shoe law firm. And then there was me, joining the civil service. Well, my stepfather Richard had said, "Someone has to stamp the forms." They'd laughed, not cruelly exactly. Just dismissively, the way you'd chuckle at a child who announces they want to be an astronaut. I'd felt my face burn, and I'd almost corrected them, almost mentioned the specialized training, the psychological evaluations, the background check that had taken 6 months. But something stopped me. Pride, maybe? Or the early stirrings of professional paranoia that would later become second nature. I'd said nothing, and in that silence their assumptions hardened into fact. Over the years, those assumptions calcified into a family mythology. Kelsey, the underachiever. Kelsey, who couldn't quite measure up. When Preston bought his 3rd vacation home, my mother had patted my hand and said, "Don't worry, dear, not everyone needs to be wealthy to be happy." When Fallon's face appeared in Forbes, my stepfather had sighed and said, "Well, at least 2 out of 3 isn't bad." I'd learned to smile tightly and change the subject. The irony was exquisite. My salary was a matter of public record, if anyone bothered to look, and it was triple what Fallon made. My federal pension would be worth more than Preston's portfolio. But money was never the point. The point was status, visibility, the ability to name drop at cocktail parties. And my job, by its very nature, couldn't be discussed at cocktail parties. I worked in silence, I lived in silence, and my family filled that silence with their own convenient fiction. "Does your department even have a name?" Fallon had asked once, her voice dripping with sisterly condescension. We were at Preston's lake house, his second lake house, for 4th of July weekend. "It has a name," I'd said, watching her through my sunglasses, "but it's not particularly interesting. Try me. Office of Internal Investigations." She'd wrinkled her nose. "So you investigate, what, missing staplers?" Preston had snorted into his beer. "Internal affairs? Jesus, Kelsey. You're a cop for bureaucrats." "Something like that," I'd murmured. What I didn't say, 2 weeks prior, I'd personally interviewed a GS-15 supervisor who'd been selling classified border surveillance data to a cartel. He'd cried in my office. They always cried. But I'd learned that explaining myself was pointless. They didn't want to understand. They wanted to categorize. And I'd been categorized as the family disappointment. It was easier to let them believe it. My mother was the worst in her way. She loved me. I never doubted that, but her love came wrapped in layers of anxiety about appearances. She'd grown up poor in rural Virginia, married my father, who died when I was 7, and then married Richard, who'd made his fortune in commercial real estate. She'd spent 30 years clawing her way into upper middle class respectability, and she guarded that status like a dragon guarding gold. "I just don't understand why you won't consider the private sector," she'd say, always with that wounded tone. "Richard's friend owns a security consulting firm. You could make real money." "I like what I do, Mom." "But what do? You never talk about it." "It's classified." She'd wave her hand. "Everything's classified these days. It's an excuse." I'd stopped trying to explain that no, actually, everything wasn't classified. That my work required a TS/SCI clearance with polygraph updates every 5 years. That I'd spent 2 weeks in Germany last month coordinating with Interpol on a joint operation. That the last time I'd been in a room with Richard's friend, it was because I was investigating his firm for fraud. Let them think I was ashamed. It was safer than the truth. The breaking point, though I didn't know it then, came at my mother's 60th birthday celebration. She'd rented out the ballroom at the country club, invited 200 of her closest friends, and orchestrated the whole evening like a Broadway production. Preston gave a toast about her strength. Fallon gave a toast about her grace. And when it was my turn, my mother had actually whispered, "Keep it short, dear." I'd kept it short. Afterward, Richard had cornered me by the bar. He'd been drinking since 5, and his face had that flushed, aggressive look that meant he was working up to something. "Your mother's worried about you," he'd said. "I'm fine. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you're 42, unmarried, working some dead-end government job." "It's not dead-end." "And you're living in a shoebox apartment in Arlington. That's not fine, Kelsey. That's failure." I'd felt something cold settle in my chest, not anger. Something worse, contempt. "I appreciate your concern," I'd said flatly. "Do you? Because I don't think you appreciate how this reflects on the family. Your mother works very hard to maintain our reputation, and when people ask what her daughter does, what is she supposed to say? Oh, Kelsey shuffles papers for the government?" I'd looked at him for a long moment. Richard Baird. My stepfather for 35 years. A man who'd never bothered to ask a single substantive question about my career. A man who measured worth in country club memberships and luxury cars. "Tell her I'm very important," I'd said, and walked away. He'd laughed, actually laughed. 3 months later, the situation with my stepfather reached its catalyst in a way I never could have predicted. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was in my office reviewing testimony transcripts when my deputy director James knocked on my door. "We have a problem," he'd said. "Customs and Border Protection, Sector Chief in El Paso. We've received allegations of evidence tampering and witness intimidation." I'd felt my stomach drop. CBP cases were always politically explosive. "How solid are the allegations?" "Solid enough." Anonymous tip came through the hotline with specifics. Dates, case numbers, names. Whoever sent this knows the internal structure. Could be a disgruntled employee. Could be, or it could be legitimate. He'd slid a folder across my desk. "The sector chief is scheduled to testify before the Senate Homeland Security Committee next week. If these allegations are true and we don't investigate, we're looking at a congressional inquiry into why we sat on our hands." I'd opened the folder. The sector chief's name was at the top, Richard Baird. My stepfather. I'd stared at the name for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. My first thought was absurd. Of course it's him. Richard had joined CBP 7 years ago, a late career move he'd spun as public service, but which everyone understood was really about ego and connections. He'd leveraged his real estate wealth to fund political campaigns, and those politicians had returned the favor with appointments. He'd risen quickly, too quickly for someone with no relevant experience, and now he ran an entire sector. And apparently he'd been abusing that power. "Boss?" James was watching me carefully. You okay? He's my stepfather, I'd said. The silence was profound. Shit, James had finally said. Do you want me to? No, I'd closed the folder. Follow protocol. Assign the investigation to Martinez. I'll recuse myself from any direct oversight, but keep me informed of major developments. If this goes to the deputy secretary, I need to be prepared. Understood. But as the week progressed, the investigation expanded in ways I hadn't anticipated. Martinez had uncovered not just evidence tampering, but a pattern of it. Financial irregularities, pressure on subordinates to falsify reports. And then, the devastating detail. Richard had been taking bribes from a private detention facility contractor to overlook health and safety violations. By Friday, Martinez was recommending criminal charges. I'd sat in my office that evening, watching the sun set over the Potomac, and felt the weight of it all pressing down. My stepfather was corrupt. The man who'd spent years mocking my career, questioning my worth, lecturing me about respectability, he was going to be arrested. And I was going to be in the room when it happened. Not because I wanted to be, but because 2 days earlier my mother had called. Darling, I need a tiny favor, she'd said. Richard is receiving an award next week from the Border Protection Foundation. It's a lunch ceremony, very prestigious. Could you possibly take an hour from work to attend? It would mean so much to him, to both of us. I should have said no. I should have invented an excuse, claimed a scheduling conflict, anything. But something in me, pride, irony, fate, had made me say yes. So on Tuesday afternoon, I found myself walking into the Jefferson Hotel's ballroom, where 200 CBP officials and political donors had gathered to celebrate my stepfather's exceptional leadership. I wore a simple charcoal suit, no agency insignia, no credentials visible. I looked like every other mid-level bureaucrat in Washington. My mother had waved me over to the family table. Preston and his wife were there, Fallon and her husband. They'd all dressed for the occasion, Preston in a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, Fallon in something designer with strategic cutouts. Kelsey, my mother had kissed my cheek, you made it! And you didn't even have to take the whole day off work. Isn't that nice? Very convenient, I'd murmured. Richard had been holding court at a nearby table, surrounded by subordinates and sycophants. He'd looked like a king receiving tribute. When he'd spotted me, he'd actually winked. The ceremony began at 1. A CBP deputy commissioner gave a speech praising Richard's innovation and dedication. A senator delivered remarks via video. And then Richard had taken the podium, accepting a crystal plaque, and launching into a speech about duty and service that made me want to scream. I've always believed, he'd said, that public service is about integrity, about holding yourself to the highest standard. Fallon had leaned over. He's so inspiring, she'd whispered. I'd said nothing. Richard's speech had just ended, applause filling the ballroom, when I'd felt my phone vibrate. A text from James Martinez has the warrant. A G's office is executing now. Subject is at the Jefferson Hotel. Are you? I'd stopped reading, because I'd looked up and seen them. 2 men in dark suits moving through the ballroom with purpose. Not security, not hotel staff, federal agents, recognizable by their bearing and their earpieces. They were scanning the room, and I knew exactly who they were looking for. Behind them, moving more slowly, was a figure I recognized immediately, the Attorney General of the United States. My mouth had gone dry. The agents had reached Richard's table just as he'd stepped down from the podium, still basking in applause. One of them had spoken quietly in his ear. Richard's face had gone from confused to annoyed. I'm sorry, he'd said loudly, but this is hardly the time. I'm in the middle of... Sir, we need you to come with us. The ballroom had started to quiet, sensing drama. Richard had pulled away. Do you know who I am? I'm a sector chief. Whatever this is about can wait until... Mr. Baird? The agent's voice had been calm but firm. We have a warrant for your arrest. You need to come with us now. The word arrest had rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. My mother had stood up, her face pale. There's been a mistake. Richard, tell them there's been a mistake. But Richard wasn't looking at my mother, he was looking at me. And suddenly, horribly, I'd seen the calculation in his eyes, the desperate search for a scapegoat, for someone to blame. His gaze had landed on me and stuck. You, he'd said, this is you. I'd felt everyone's eyes turn to me. Richard, what are you? My mother had started. She works for the government, Richard had snarled. Internal something. She's behind this. She's always been jealous of me, and now she's manufactured some kind of... Sir, the agent had interrupted. This has nothing to do with... Don't tell me what it has to do with. Richard had lunged toward me, moving so fast that Preston had jumped up to intercept him. You vindictive little bitch. You couldn't stand that I actually accomplished something. You've been waiting for years to... He'd grabbed my wrist. Hard. You stole those documents, he'd hissed, his face inches from mine. You planted evidence. I know you did, and you're going to pay for this. One of the agents had moved to pull him back, but Richard had shaken him off. Before anyone could react, he'd produced a pair of handcuffs, his own from his belt, and snapped one cuff onto my wrist. The ballroom had erupted in chaos. Your place is in prison, Richard had shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. You stole those documents. Now you will live in jail, and no one will help you. I'd stood very still. The handcuff had been cold against my skin. My mother was crying. Fallon was screaming something. Preston was trying to physically restrain Richard while the federal agents called for backup. And then, cutting through the noise like a knife, that's enough. The Attorney General had entered the ballroom. The room had fallen silent instantly. Not because anyone recognized him, though some did, but because of the authority in his voice, the weight of his presence. He was flanked by two more agents, both stone-faced. He'd walk toward us with measured steps, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving with the terrible inevitability of federal power. He'd stopped in front of me, without looking at Richard, without acknowledging anyone else. He'd reached into his pocket and produced a small key. Your arrest, he'd said quietly, turning to Richard, is annulled. You attempted to take into custody the executive director of the Internal Affairs Division. The Attorney General had unlocked the handcuff. It had fallen from my wrist with a soft click. He'd handed the empty handcuffs to one of his escorts. The man had silently stepped forward and clamped them onto Richard's wrists. Richard's face had gone from red to white. The executive, what? The Attorney General had finally looked at him. Ms. Voss is the senior official responsible for investigating corruption within the Department of Homeland Security. Your case was referred to her office 3 weeks ago. She recused herself due to the familial conflict. But her position is not in question, yours is. He'd turned to me. Ma'am, I apologize for this disruption. Are you injured? No, sir, I'd managed. Good, he'd nodded to his agents. Take Mr. Baird into custody. Read him his rights. And someone get hotel security to clear this room. As the agents had moved Richard toward the exit, he'd stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, complete incomprehension. Like he was seeing me for the first time and couldn't reconcile the person in front of him with the person he'd created in his mind. My mother had collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands. Preston had stood frozen, his mouth actually open. Fallon had whispered, "Executive Director?" like she was testing the words in a foreign language. The crystal plaque Richard had received, the award for his exceptional leadership, had rolled off the table and shattered on the marble.